The ladle held exactly 340 milliliters. I know that because I measured it myself, the first week I took the job. Not out of suspicion. The camp's supply coordinator wasn't the type to short people, but because I'd spent 31 years in commercial kitchens, and the habit of knowing your equipment was something you never unlearned. 340 milliliters of lentil broth per draw, 160 grams of flatbread per person, half a cup of boiled root vegetable on the days we had root vegetable. Those were the rations for Tethai's resettlement. Point 7. On the moon the locals called Arath's Cradle, in the 7th month of what the transit authorities' paperwork called a temporary displacement event, and the people standing in my line called the worst year of their lives. I was 59 years old, recently widowed, and in possession of a certificate in large batch nutrition preparation that had kept me employed on 4 different frontier stations over the course of a career that was, by any honest reckoning, unremarkable. My daughter had wanted me to come home after Pell died. I told her I wasn't ready to sit still. She'd said that was grief talking. She was probably right, but I took the job anyway. The camp held between 1,200 and 1,900 people on any given day, depending on which transit corridors were open, and which had been closed by the ongoing territorial negotiations between the Varith sovereignty and the Frontier Compact. The negotiations had been ongoing for 11 years. Nobody I spoke to expected them to resolve in the next 11. The displaced people in my line had come from 5 different border settlements, spoke 4 languages between them, and shared a single quality that you noticed within the first week. They had all stopped expecting things to get better. Not in a dramatic way, not with anger. The expectation had simply drained out of them, the way water drains out of a cracked vessel, steadily, quietly, until one day you pick it up and realize it's been empty for a long time. My job was to make sure they ate. That was it, that was the whole of it. Breakfast service began at 6th hour. The line formed at 5th. By 8th hour most days we were done. I cleaned, restocked, prepped the afternoon supplement run and was back in my bunk by 9th. 7 days a week, no rotation by choice. My supervisor, a compact young man named Darius who wore the same faded green vest every day regardless of weather, had offered me days off twice in the first month. I told him I didn't need them. He'd looked at me the way people look at someone who is clearly working through something, and hadn't offered again. I was working through something. That was fair. But the work helped. The line helped. Standing in the same place, doing the same thing, watching the same faces come and go, there was a rhythm to it that my body found before my mind did, and by the 3rd week I was sleeping through the night for the first time since Pell's diagnosis. You learn faces in a soup line. Not names, usually names come later if they come at all, but faces. And the particular way a face holds itself when it is carrying something heavy without wanting anyone to see that it's heavy. There was a man who came through every morning in the 2nd week, gray-haired and square-shouldered, who always took his bowl with both hands and said, "Thank you," in a voice that came from somewhere below the everyday. There was a woman with 3 children, 2 old enough to carry their own trays, 1 not, who organized the 4 of them with the precise efficiency of someone who had been doing the logistics of survival long enough that it had become reflex. There was an elderly man who always arrived at the same point in the line, always alone, always looking at the floor until his bowl was in his hands, and then he would look up, and there was in his face, briefly, something that I can only describe as the particular relief of being tended to, of having someone, even a stranger in a camp kitchen, register that you existed and needed something and could be given it. That was the whole of the job when you stripped it down to its core. You registered that someone existed. You gave them what they needed. You did it without theater, without pity, without making them feel like the receiving of a kindness was itself a burden. 31 years of commercial kitchens had taught me a great many things about food, and almost nothing about cooking that hadn't already been in me by the time I was 12, but they had taught me that the plain competence of a person who is fed, how it straightens the spine slightly, how it restores, in some small way, the sense that the world is not entirely indifferent to whether you are in it. The small dragon appeared for the first time on a morning in late Wrath Month, which was the camp's 6th month of operation and my 8th week on site. I almost didn't see it. The line at Resettlement Point 7 ran along the eastern wall of what had been, in its previous life, a freight staging building, high corrugated ceiling, wide cargo doors that we'd fitted with canvas windbreaks, a floor that still bore the ghost outlines of equipment pallets in the grime. The service counter was a temporary steel fixture that Darius's crew had assembled in the first week, running about 12 meters end to end, with warming trays recessed into the top and our prep station behind. At the far eastern end, where the counter met the wall, there was a gap of about 60 centimeters, a leftover from the way the fixtures had been installed, never fully closed off. On cold mornings, which most mornings were on Arath's cradle, a draft came through that gap that you could feel from 3 meters away. The small dragon was sitting in that gap. It wasn't at the gap, or near the gap. It was in it, tucked into the 60-centimeter space between the counter end and the wall, seated on the floor with its knees drawn up and its tail curled around its feet, looking out at the serving area with one good eye and one that was filmed over with a pale, grayish membrane that caught the light in a way the other one didn't. It was small, not hatchling small, but not grown either, somewhere in the difficult middle stage where the proportions of a thing are still sorting themselves into what they'll eventually become. Its scales were a deep brownish red where they were undamaged, the color of old brick in afternoon light, but along its left flank and across the base of its left wing, there was a wide swath of scarring where the scales had regrown wrong, ridged and paler, the same gray-pink as the membrane over its eye, raised in patterns that suggested something very hot had been involved at some point. The left wing itself was clipped short, half the length of the right, and it held it differently, tucked in closer, as if it was protecting it without being conscious of doing so. It was watching me. Not the food, not the line, me. I'd been in the frontier long enough to know that there were dragon communities on several of the border moons, and that the territorial situation had displaced some of them, along with the human settlements. I'd seen 2 adult dragons in the camp's population, both large, both avoiding the service counter and receiving separate rations from the logistics section. And I'd seen what I'd been told were dragon children once or twice at a distance, though I couldn't have told you much about them because they'd always been with adults and I'd never had reason to interact. I had not expected one to be sitting 6 feet from my prep station, before breakfast service. I looked at it for a moment, it looked at me. The good eye was amber, a deep, clear amber with a vertical pupil, like a cat's eye scaled up and given a quality of attention that no cat had ever really managed. "You hungry?" I said. It didn't answer, I hadn't expected it to. I ladled broth into a bowl, added the bread, added the root vegetable, it was a root vegetable morning, and set the bowl on the floor near the gap. Then I turned back to my prep work, because service was going to start in 40 minutes and I still had 3 trays to portion. When I looked again, 10 minutes later, the bowl was empty and the dragon was gone. I picked up the bowl, washed it, and didn't think about it again until the next morning when it was back in the same spot. This time I was ready. I'd portioned the bowl during prep and kept it on a low shelf near the eastern end. When I saw the amber eye watching from the gap, I took the bowl down and set it in the same place as before, without ceremony, without comment, the way you'd set food out for a barn cat that had decided your building was acceptable. The small dragon waited until I'd turned away, then came forward, ate, and retreated. It came back the following morning, and the morning after that. By the second week I had established a routine around it, the way you establish a routine around anything that shows up at the same time in the same place with the same needs. You accommodate it. The bowl was always ready. I always set it in the same spot, always turned away after, always gave it the same window of time before I retrieved the bowl. It was never late, and it was never early, and it never ate in my direct line of sight if it could avoid it. What it did, after a while, was watch my hands. I noticed it first on a morning when I was kneading the flatbread dough. We made it from scratch on the days the pre-portioned supply ran short, which was about 3 days in 7. I'd been kneading for about 10 minutes, and I'd glanced toward the gap for no particular reason, and I found the amber eye fixed not on my face but on my hands, not with hunger, with something I could only describe as attention, the same quality of focus you see in someone who is genuinely trying to understand how something is done. I kept kneading. After a moment I said, without looking directly at it, "It's just flour and water. Frontier-grade flour, so it's grainier than what you'd get in a proper kitchen. You have to work it longer." The amber eye didn't move. "The dough tells you when it's ready," I said. "It stops fighting you. You feel it change under your hands, goes from rough and resistant to smooth and cooperative. That's when you know." I wasn't talking to it exactly. I was talking the way you talk when you've spent most of your adult life in kitchens where there was always noise and conversation, and the absence of noise felt like something was wrong. Pell used to say I narrated my own life. He'd meant it fondly. The small dragon watched my hands for the entire kneading. When I shaped the loaves and set them aside to rest, it shifted its attention back to the bowl. After it ate, it retreated to the gap. I went on with my morning. The 3rd month settled into a particular shape that I remember more clearly than the months before it, not because anything dramatic happened, but because it was the period in which the small dragon became, in some quiet and unremarkable way, part of the texture of the mornings rather than an anomaly in them. I stopped registering its arrival as something separate from the work. It was there when I arrived, or it arrived shortly after, and it watched what I was doing, and I talked while I worked, and somewhere in that overlap a thing existed that I didn't have a name for and didn't particularly need to name. The conversations, if they could be called that, were one-sided but not solitary. There is a difference between talking to a room and talking at a wall, and the difference is whether anything in the room is paying attention. The amber eye paid attention. It tracked the motion of what I was working on. It followed the logic of a process, even when the process had no words attached. I could see it happen. The moment something became clear to it, in a slight adjustment of posture, a leaning forward of the head, a quality of readiness that meant it had understood what came next before I did it. I found myself, on those mornings, being more deliberate in what I was doing than I might otherwise have been. Not performing. I want to be precise about this, but finding the care that was already in the work and not rushing past it. 31 years of kitchen work produces a great deal of efficiency that can, if you're not careful, hollow out into mere speed. The flatbread is bread because someone shaped it with attention, not because someone processed dough into a loaf-shaped object. When you are being watched by something that does not know the difference between one and the other, you tend, naturally, to be the thing that knows. On the 43rd day, I remember because I'd marked it in my shift log for no reason I could now reconstruct, just a date I happened to record. The small dragon came forward while I was working, without waiting to be given the bowl, and stood about a meter from where I was standing at the prep counter. This was new. I didn't react. I kept working, monitoring from the edge of my vision, giving it time to understand that the closer proximity wasn't going to change anything about the environment. After about 3 minutes it moved again, not retreating, moving to the side, angling for a better view of whatever I was doing with my hands. I was pitting stone fruit that morning, a prep task for the afternoon supplement. There was a rhythm to it, thumb, turn, twist, drop, and I'd been doing it long enough that my hands moved without my thinking about them, and I suppose from the outside it might have looked like something worth studying. "Stone fruit," I said, "you pit them like this." I turned slightly so that the angle was better if it wanted to see. I didn't look at it directly. The single good amber eye tracked my hands. I pitted stone fruit for 40 minutes. The small dragon stood approximately 1 meter away for all of it, then retreated when Darius came through the eastern door to check on morning prep. By the time Darius left, the dragon was back in the gap, watching. I started leaving a second portion alongside the first. Not a large one. I wasn't pulling from the camp's rations. I was taking from the prep surplus, the material that would otherwise go into the recycler at end of service. Half a bowl of broth, a piece of bread, sometimes fruit when we had it. The second portion was eaten every time. I wondered sometimes if there was more than one of them, but I never saw more than the one. The same scarring, the same clipped wing, the same filmed eye. The same amber eye that tracked my hands with the focused attention of someone learning something. I didn't tell Darius. Not for any particular reason, it wasn't a secret exactly, but because mentioning it felt like it would make it into an administrative situation, and administrative situations had a way of producing outcomes nobody had intended. The small dragon wasn't taking from the line. It was taking from surplus. It wasn't a problem. I saw no reason to make it one. The camp's population shifted through late Rathmonth and into early Sethdawn. The territorial negotiations produced one of their periodic non-agreements, which caused a fresh displacement event in 2 of the border settlements, which brought 400 new people to Point 7 over the course of 3 weeks. My line got longer. My mornings got harder. On the worst days, we ran short on flatbread by 7th hour, and had to supplement with hard crackers from the emergency stock, which everyone hated but ate anyway. Through all of it, the small dragon came every morning. I learned its rhythms. It arrived between 5:30 and 5:45, always before the first refugees came through the main doors. It preferred the broth warm rather than hot. I figured this out by accident when I set a bowl that had cooled slightly, and it came forward for it immediately rather than waiting its usual interval. It didn't like the hard crackers. On the days I'd set one alongside the bowl as a supplement, I'd find it beside the empty bowl, untouched. It had a habit, after eating, of sitting for a few minutes at the near edge of the gap rather than retreating all the way into it. And on those mornings when it did this, I sometimes talked. Not at it, exactly, but near it, in the way I might have talked to Pell on an ordinary morning while he sat with his tea and I moved around the kitchen. About the day ahead. About the weather, which was genuinely interesting on Arath's cradle, where the moon's tidal relationship with its parent planet produced thermal effects that could take a clear dawn from cold to warm in under an hour. About whatever I was making. The amber eye would rest on me during these times, not on my hands, on my face. I found that less unsettling than I would have expected. Partly because the attention in it never felt threatening. It was curious, not predatory, and curious in a way that felt, if I was honest, like being seen. And partly because I am the kind of person who talks into a room regardless of who is in it, so the presence of a listener, however quiet, was simply a comfort. I didn't know its name. I didn't try to give it one. I called it nothing, which felt right. Naming it would have changed our arrangement into something with edges and expectations. And what we had, whatever it was, had no edges that I could identify. In the 4th month of its appearances, the dreams stopped. I hadn't quite registered that I'd been having them until the night I didn't, a night so ordinary and untroubled that I woke the next morning feeling scraped clean, the way a pan feels after proper scouring, and lay in my bunk for a moment not understanding why everything felt different. It took me most of morning prep to realize that I'd slept through the night without dreaming of the hospital room, without waking at 3:30 to the particular quality of silence that had followed the ventilator going quiet. I just slept. I set out the morning bowl with something I didn't fully examine and went about my work. It didn't last. The dreams came back now and then, and I knew they would for years yet. Grief doesn't resolve on a schedule. but the quality of the mornings changed in that period in a way I found easier to accept than to explain. There was a reason to be in the kitchen before the world woke up. Not a reason I'd chosen, not a reason I'd constructed to help myself along, just a fact of the day, no more deliberate than the fact that the broth needed starting and the flatbread needed kneading. Something was there that was glad I was there. Not because I was remarkable, not because of anything I'd done beyond the most ordinary acts of provision, but glad in the way any creature is glad of a reliable warmth on a cold morning. You do not have to be extraordinary to provide that. You only have to show up. I had been showing up. I knew how to do that at least. The camp had a medical station, a portable clinic unit staffed by 2 overworked practitioners, Heska and a lanky young physician named Orvin who was, I suspected, considerably earlier in his career than he'd led the assignment board to believe. Heska was the older of the two, and had the manner of someone who had been doing emergency medicine in difficult places for long enough to have achieved a kind of professional serenity. We developed a friendship of the kitchen and clinic corridor type, the kind built from daily proximity, and the shared recognition that both of us were spending our days keeping people functional against odds that didn't particularly favor it. She asked me once in the 5th month of my posting whether I'd made any connections since arriving. She meant human ones. I understood whether I'd found people to talk to, whether the isolation was getting to me. It was a clinical question phrased as a casual one, and I knew it. "I've got a routine," I said. "That's not what I asked." "I know." I thought about the amber eye watching my hands over the dough. "I've got company in the mornings." She waited. "A dragon," I said. "Young one, shows up before service, eats from the surplus, watches me work." Heska was quiet for a moment. Then she said, carefully, "Does it come in contact with any of the camp's population?" "Not that I've seen. It's there before the line opens and gone before the first people come through." She nodded. Something in her expression shifted, not alarm exactly, but a particular professional readjustment, the look of someone recalibrating around new information. "Does it make any sound?" she said. "None, it's very quiet." "Is it injured, the scarring?" "Old," I said. "Healed over, it moves fine. The wings clipped, that's permanent, I think, but it doesn't seem to bother it." Heska nodded again, more slowly. Then she said, "I'd leave it be if I were you. Keep doing what you're doing." "That's what I was planning." "Good." She paused, seeming to want to say something else, then appeared to decide against it. "Good," she said again, and asked if I had any surplus protein, which was her way of changing the subject. We talked about protein allocation for 10 minutes. When she left, I had the distinct feeling she knew something about my morning visitor that she hadn't chosen to share, but I had no particular basis for the feeling, and I didn't push it. I kept doing what I was doing. The 6th month brought a hard stretch, 3 weeks of near-continuous arrivals, a supply chain disruption that cut our fresh protein allocation by 40%, 2 incidents of queue disturbance that Darius had to manage with the help of the camp's small security detail, and a viral illness that moved through the population with the efficient malice of all respiratory viruses in crowded enclosed spaces. Heska and Orvin ran on fumes. Half my kitchen volunteers got sick, and I ran shorter staffed than at any point since I'd arrived. The small dragon never missed a morning. I don't know why I found that meaningful. It was a pattern, and it was consistent, and I was a person who found comfort in consistent patterns. But there was more to it than that, and I knew it even if I wasn't going to say it out loud. During those 3 weeks, when my body hurt from double shift standing, and the line never seemed to get shorter, and everything felt like it was running on reserve power, the 50 minutes between arriving at the kitchen and the start of service, the 50 minutes when it was me and the morning and the small scarred creature watching from the gap, were the stillest 50 minutes in my day. I didn't think much about what it was in those mornings. I didn't think about the larger world or the negotiations or the camps or the 11 years of stalemate I was somewhere inside of. I thought about the broth temperature. I thought about whether the flatbread was rising the way it should. I thought about the amber eye and what it was tracking and whether it had worked out the principle of the warming trays. Heat the trays first, then the pots, so the pots don't have to do all the work of recovery. I suspected it had. There was a morning in the third week of the hard stretch when I'd forgotten to preheat the trays, tired, moving faster than careful, and I'd seen the amber eye flick to the trays and then back to me with what I could only read as mild concern, or perhaps mild surprise that the usual sequence had been broken. I'd caught it and corrected it, and the amber eye had returned to its default state of interested observation. I know, I'd said, I was rushing. The amber eye had held on me for a moment, then moved to the pot. I'd slowed down after that. It had started doing something new around the 7th week of the 6th month. After eating, when it sat at the near edge of the gap, it would sometimes produce a low sound, not loud enough to carry more than a few meters, more vibration than audible noise, something I felt in my sternum before I heard it with my ears. It wasn't distress. It had a quality of regularity, almost of rhythm, that made me think of someone humming to themselves without noticing. I didn't comment on it. I let it do what it was doing. On the mornings it made that sound, I usually talked more than usual, keeping a rhythm of my own, and it occurred to me later that we'd worked out something like a conversation, not in words or anything close to words, but in the matching of a rhythm, one thing answering another thing. Pell had been a musician, an amateur one, nothing serious. He played a string instrument in a small group of his friends, 3 or 4 times a year, and I'd sometimes sat in the next room listening to them work through something together. The sound through the wall had been a comfort even when I hadn't been paying attention to it, the specific quality of people doing a thing together. I thought about that. On the mornings the sound was there. In the 7th month, near its end, something happened that I have tried to describe to people since and have never quite managed. I'd arrived early that morning, earlier than usual, before 4th hour, because we had a double breakfast run scheduled and I needed the extra prep time. The freight building was empty when I came in. I lit the heating units, set the trays, started the broth. The first gray light of Arath's dawn was just beginning to come through the clerestory windows along the building's eastern face, and the space had that particular quality it had in those early minutes, high and quiet and larger seeming than it was in the daytime, the ceiling lost in shadow, the warming trays glowing orange along the counter. The small dragon was already there. It wasn't in the gap. It was standing in the open space behind the counter, about 3 meters from where I'd come in, and it was not alone. There were 2 others. They were large, not the largest dragons I'd seen in my limited exposure, but adult large, and in the dim pre-dawn light of the freight building they seemed larger still. One had scales of a deep, cold blue that caught the warming tray light, and held it differently than the small one's brick red did. A blue so saturated it was almost black at the joints and spine, gradating out to something lighter at the wing edges, the whole of it with a surface quality like polished stone rather than leather. The other was paler, a color I want to call silver, but that isn't quite right, more like the color of ice seen from below, with a faint iridescence at the scale edges that shifted when it moved. They were not threatening. I want to be clear about this because the facts, described plainly, might sound like threat. 2 large adult dragons in a kitchen at 4 in the morning is a sentence that can easily go wrong. But there was nothing in how they held themselves that read as aggressive. They were still, attentive. Their eyes, both of them, were on me, not on the small dragon between them, not on the food. The small dragon made the low sound, the one I'd come to know as its morning rhythm, felt in the sternum more than heard with the ears. I said, because it was 4 in the morning and I was 59 years old, and I had been doing this particular thing every day for 7 months, and I was not going to be knocked off my routine by the presence of a large audience. You're early. I said it to the small one, specifically. Then I turned back to the counter and started the broth. I heard movement behind me. I didn't startle. I kept working and monitored from my peripheral vision, and what I saw was that the two large dragons had moved slightly, not toward me, sideways, positioning the small one between them with a quality of arrangement that I can only describe as protective and deliberate. The silver pale one lowered its head, not to me, to the small dragon. A gesture I'd have called deferential if I'd seen it between humans. I portioned the morning bowl. I set it on the floor in the usual spot. I turned back to my prep work. The broth took 20 minutes to come to temperature. I spent them working and not turning around, and the only sounds were the burner and the occasional low vibration from behind me, and the not-quite silence of a large building in an early morning. When I next looked, all three of them were gone. The bowl was empty. I washed it and kept going. I told Heska that afternoon. I didn't have a particular reason. It had been a strange morning and she was someone I talked to. She listened without interrupting, which was her habit, and when I finished, she was quiet for longer than felt comfortable. The blue one, she said. How large specifically? I held my hands apart to approximate the span of the head. She looked at the space between my hands and went very still. And it didn't approach you? No, neither of them did. And the small one was between them. Between them and slightly in front. They'd arranged themselves around it. I paused. Around it, not with it. There's a difference. I know. Heska set down her stylus. She'd been doing paperwork when I came in. She didn't pick it up again. Adra, how much do you know about the Varith sovereignty? What the briefings say. They're the other party in the territorial negotiations. Large dragon polity, about a dozen core systems, and a contested buffer zone that includes this moon. They've been in negotiation with the compact for 11 years, without resolution. Do you know why there's been no resolution? The briefings say it's a boundary dispute, resource extraction rights in the buffer zone. Heska looked at me. She had the face of someone choosing their words with great care. It's partly that, she said. It's partly other things. The sovereignty doesn't enter negotiations when its political structure is in a state of succession uncertainty. It's a stability protocol. They've held to it for as long as anyone has records. Until a line of succession is established and secured, they don't sign agreements that could bind a future leadership they can't guarantee. She paused. The sovereignty's last acknowledged heir died in a border incident 5 years ago. There was a second heir, a younger one, injured in the same incident. The sovereignty has not confirmed whether that heir survived. I sat with that for a moment. How old would the second heir be now? I said. Young, said Heska, not hatchling young, but young. The freight building, the gap at the end of the counter, the brick-red scales, the scarring along one flank, the clipped left wing, the filmed eye, the amber eye watching my hands. Heska, I said. I don't know for certain, she said. I want to be clear about that. I have never been told anything for certain, but there have been people come through the clinic. Some of them ask unusual questions. Some of them ask about you specifically, and I have answered those questions in the way that seemed most helpful, and I have told no one else. How long have people been asking about me? Since the 3rd week. I looked at the wall for a while. Why didn't you tell me? Because the most valuable thing about what you were doing, she said carefully, was that you were doing it without knowing. If I'd told you, it would have become something else. You'd have been careful, deliberate. The thing that mattered was that you were just feeding it, because it was there and it was hungry, and that was the kind of person you are. I thought about that. The territorial negotiations, I said. The Varith sovereignty will not sign a succession-binding agreement until the heir is confirmed alive and secured, and the succession line is re-established. The negotiations have been stalled on this point for 5 years. There have been, in that period, 3 significant escalations that nearly became something worse, fleet movements that pulled back at the last moment. engagement protocols authorized, and then stood down. She paused. I don't know all of the reasons they were stood down. I know some of them. I know that the reports going back to the sovereignty's internal council have included, for at least the last several months, accounts of the heir's status, her daily status, including the fact that she was eating. I said nothing. You've been providing proof of life, said Heska, every morning, to people who needed proof of life more than they needed anything else, including, I think, the knowledge that the heir was not just surviving but being treated with. She stopped. She was being treated as if she mattered, in an ordinary way, which is apparently not a thing that was easy to come by. The thermal units hummed. Somewhere in the camp, someone was talking in a raised voice about the water allocation. Outside the clerestory windows, the light was going orange with the moon's late afternoon. I was just feeding her, I said. Yes, said Heska, that's exactly what I mean. I didn't sleep well that night. Not from distress, the dreams didn't come back, but from the particular sleeplessness of lying in the dark thinking about something that has rearranged itself around you while you weren't paying attention. I had not been doing anything different. That was the thought I kept returning to. The bowl, the broth, the flatbread, the talking into a room habit that Pell had always found endearing. Every morning for 7 months, I had done the same unremarkable thing for the same unremarkable reason. Because she'd been hungry, because she'd been there, because feeding someone who is hungry is the simplest form of decency available to a person with food. And somehow the unremarkable thing had been running through some calculus I'd never been shown, and coming out the other side as something enormous and load-bearing. I didn't know what to do with that. I wasn't sure there was anything to do with it. I thought about what Heska had said. The most valuable thing about what you were doing was that you were doing it without knowing. That was both true and deeply uncomfortable, because it meant the value was in the not knowing. It meant that if I'd known, I'd have changed something, been more careful, more deliberate, more conscious of an audience. And in changing it, I'd have made it into something else, something performed rather than simply done. 7 months of soup and bread, and talking about the weather had mattered, because I had treated her as someone who deserved soup and bread and company on a cold morning, not as someone whose continued existence was load-bearing in the architecture of a peace that 11 years of formal negotiations had failed to produce. That was a strange thing to lie with in the dark. I thought about the 3 escalations Heska had mentioned, fleet movements, engagement protocols authorized. She hadn't said how large those movements were. She hadn't said how close the authorization had come to an order. I found I didn't particularly want to know the specifics, because the specifics would turn an abstract enormity into a concrete one, and the concrete version would require me to sit with the weight of what might have happened if I'd been a different kind of person, or if I'd taken a different posting, or if Darius's kitchen had been set up in a way that left no 60-centimeter gap at the eastern end of the counter. I didn't take that line of thought any further. It led somewhere vertiginous and unproductive, and at 59 years old I had acquired enough hard experience to know that vertiginous and unproductive were not where you wanted to be at midnight. What I came back to instead was this: she'd been hungry. Every morning for 8 months she'd been hungry, and every morning I'd had food, and so I'd given her some. That was the whole of it. The rest of it, the air, the sovereignty, the fleet movements, the negotiations, the proof of life that had apparently been going upstream every morning like a signal I'd never been told I was sending, that was all consequence. The original act was just the bowl and the broth and the draft that came through the gap on cold mornings. Pell would have found this funny, not unkindly. He had a gift for finding the absurd particularity in large events. The way history turns on small hinges, he used to say, and the hinges don't know their hinges. I lay in the dark and thought about that, and it was something close to comfort. I was back at the counter at 3:30 as always. I portioned the morning bowl. I set the broth on. She was in the gap when I turned around. Just her alone, the way she almost always was. I looked at her for a moment. She looked at me. In the pre-dawn light of the freight building, the amber eye was very clear, that deep, vertical pupilled amber that I had spent 8 months registering as interesting and familiar without ever articulating exactly what it reminded me of. I knew now what it reminded me of. I'd been looking at it in its larger form in the face of Veth Soratha, and I'd recognized it before I'd understood what I was recognizing. There was a quality in it this morning that might have been different and might have been the same, and might simply have been that I was looking at it differently. Waiting, maybe. Watching to see what I would do with what I'd been told. I said, I know a bit more than I did yesterday. The amber eye was steady. Doesn't change the broth, I said, just so you know. I set the bowl down and turned back to my work. The low sound started after a few minutes. The morning rhythm, the one I felt in my sternum before I heard it with my ears. I was kneading the dough by then, the supply was short again, scratch bread morning, and my hands moved through the familiar push and fold of it without my directing them. Still too rough, I said, about nothing in particular. It'll come. Darius arrived at 5th hour with a supply manifest, and a problem about the afternoon protein allocation that we spent 20 minutes solving and 40 minutes arguing about. When he left, the bowl was empty and the gap was unoccupied and morning service was 12 minutes away. I cleaned the bowl and went back to my station. For the next 4 weeks the mornings ran exactly as they had run before. I had thought, lying awake the previous night, that knowing might change something in how I moved through those 50 minutes, that some awareness of what was passing between us, what was being observed, what the observation carried might make the air different, might add a weight of ceremony to a thing that had never had any. It didn't. The broth was the same temperature. The flatbread was the same texture. The amber eye was where it always was. I was glad of that. I had not been sure I would be, and I was. The morning she didn't come, I knew something had changed. It was 4 weeks after the conversation with Heska. I'd been counting, I realized, without admitting to myself that I was counting. Not anxiously or not entirely anxiously, but the counting was there. 40 days she'd come after I knew. 41, 43. And then a morning where I arrived at 3:30 and portioned the bowl and set the broth on, and the gap was empty, and stayed empty through the whole 50 minutes of pre-service prep. And I finished breakfast service and cleaned the kitchen and went about my afternoon, and felt the absence in the way you feel the absence of something that has been regular and then isn't, a weight whose presence you only fully notice once it's gone. She didn't come the next morning either, or the one after. On those mornings I still set out the bowl. Not hopefully, or not only hopefully, but because setting out the bowl had become part of the sequence. The way starting the broth was part of the sequence, and preheating the trays was part of the sequence. And removing a step from a sequence that has run the same way for 8 months is harder than it sounds when the step is small. On the 3rd morning I didn't set it out, because that seemed like the honest thing, and I went about my prep with the faint, practical awareness of a person who has decided to stop waiting for something, and is managing the adjustment. On the 4th morning, I found Heska in the corridor outside the clinic before breakfast service. This was unusual. She was generally at the clinic long before I arrived, and I stopped. Is she? I started. She's well, Heska said. She's been moved to somewhere more appropriate for what comes next. A pause. There was a sovereignty convoy that came through the transit corridor 3 days ago. Medical configuration. I don't know the specifics, but it was not the kind of convoy you see in a resettlement context. I nodded. She's well, Heska said again. I want you to know that. I know. I went back to the kitchen and put on the broth. The line opened at 6th hour, 340 milliliters per draw, 160 of flatbread, half a cup of root vegetable on the days we had it. The gap at the eastern end of the counter sat empty. I worked around it the way you work around a space that has been vacated, with the mild, unspoken acknowledgement of a shape that was there and now isn't. The draft still came through it on cold mornings, the same as it always had. I found myself, in the second week after she was gone, not looking at it during service, not avoiding it, simply not marking it as a point of reference in the way I had for the past 8 months. The way your eye travels naturally to the thing in a room that is most alive, and when that thing is no longer present, adjusts to the fact of its absence without being told to. Darius noticed nothing. He was a practical man, and his attention was on the supply chains, which remained difficult, and the population count, which was still running high. The afternoon supplements were short again, and he was trying to source additional protein through a contact at the Transit Authority's Freight Division, a project that occupied most of his waking hours, and which I was happy to let occupy them, since it kept his questions focused on procurement rather than on what his kitchen supervisor was doing with her mornings. I was doing nothing unusual with my mornings. That was the whole point. 2 weeks after that, a woman arrived at the kitchen door in the middle of morning service. I say woman because there is no better word, or there wasn't one in the first moment. She was tall, 2 meters at least, and she wore a traveling garment of deep blue fabric that moved with her the way fabric doesn't when it's only fabric. Her features were angular with a sharpness that wasn't quite human, the jaw heavier, the brow ridge more pronounced, the eyes amber with vertical pupils set in a face whose bone structure suggested something other than what I'd grown up around. There was a quality to her stillness that I recognized from 8 months of mornings. The same attention, the same economy of movement. She stood in the doorway for a moment before entering, and I watched her take in the room, the counter, the line, the canvas windbreaks, the warming trays, the floor with its ghost outlines of old equipment pallets, with the focused survey of someone who has been told exactly what they'll find and wants to confirm that the telling was accurate. Her eyes moved along the counter's length, stopped at the eastern end, stopped at the gap, held there for a moment, then came to me. I was in the middle of ladling broth. I kept ladling. The woman waited until the person in front of me had moved on, then stepped forward. She didn't take a tray. She stood at the counter and looked at me with those amber eyes and said, in a voice that was low and very precise, "You are a dramos." "I am," I said. I set the ladle down. The line had paused. Darius's regular assistant, a girl named Faye who had good instincts, had come up beside me and was continuing service without being asked. I made a note to mention that to Darius. "I am Veth Soratha," the woman said. "I hold the council seat of the third circle of the Varith sovereignty. I have traveled 9 hours to speak with you." I wiped my hands on my apron. "All right," I said. "May we speak somewhere?" "Here is fine," I said. "Say what you need to say." She looked at me for a moment. Something moved in those amber eyes, not offense, not surprise exactly, more a recalibration of some kind, the same recalibration I'd seen in Heska's face 8 months earlier. "Very well." She placed both hands flat on the counter, not a threat, a formality, something I suspected was a sovereignty gesture of direct address. The heir of the Varith sovereignty arrived at the sanctuary of Vel Karathi 9 days ago. She is well. She is beginning the process of formal confirmation of her lineage and succession status. A pause. This process has been delayed for 5 years by the uncertainty of her survival. There are consequences to that delay, agreements that have not been made, settlements that have not been settled, people still in camps who might not be if matters had proceeded differently. I thought, without meaning to, about the man who took his bowl with both hands and said thank you from somewhere below the everyday, the woman with the 3 children and the logistics of survival that had become reflex, the elderly man and the brief relief in his face. "I know," I said. "The heir spoke of you in her confirmation testimony," said Veth Soratha. "She was asked to account for the period of her concealment and survival, the nature of her conditions, the people who assisted her." She spoke at some length. A pause. She was specific. I said nothing. She described your hand, said Vethsaratha. She was asked to describe the conditions of her care, and she described your hands. She described the sound of your voice. She described the color and temperature of the broth. She described the flatbread. Something altered in the precise, formal tone, not breaking exactly but softening at the edge, like ice at the first sign of warmth. She said that you spoke to her about dough, about the point at which dough stops resisting and becomes cooperative. She said that you told her the dough tells you when it is ready. I looked at the counter for a moment. I talk when I work, I said. It's a habit. She remembers everything you said. In 8 months. I didn't know what to say to that. I thought about the amber eye on my hands in those cold mornings, tracking the motion with a quality of attention I'd never been able to quite define. Memory, maybe. The kind of careful, archived attention that does not trust the world to repeat what it is showing you, and so presses it into permanence while it can. We are aware, said Vethsaratha, of what the presence of the air in this camp and the reports of her condition meant to the sovereignty's internal stability during a period of significant tension. We are aware that 3 escalations in the past 2 years were contained, in part, because there was evidence that the air was alive and being treated with. She stopped, chose her next words with care. With the kind of ordinary care that indicates a stable environment, that she was being seen as a person rather than a complication. She was hungry in the mornings, I said. I had food. Yes, said Vethsaratha. I know. And then slowly she brought those amber eyes down from my face down to the counter between us, and she bowed her head not low, not dramatically, just the particular tilt of forehead toward a surface that I'd seen the silver-pale dragon make in the freight building one morning before dawn, toward the small brick-red creature between them, a gesture of acknowledgement, of something recognized and named. The kitchen was warm. The broth smelled of the herbs Darris's supply team had managed to source this week, something green and slightly sharp that Pell would have said cut through the heaviness of the lentils very nicely. Along the counter, Faye was still working the line with an equanimity that I was going to mention to Darris as soon as I had the chance. The formal confirmation will be announced in approximately 12 days, said Vethsaratha, straightening. Following that, the Sovereignty's Council will be in a position to resume full negotiations with the Frontier Compact. There is a cautious expectation that a framework agreement may be reachable within the season. If it is reached, the resettlement camps along the buffer zone will begin the drawdown process within 3 months of ratification. I thought about my line, 1,200 people on the slow days, 1,900 on the hard ones, 7 months of them. That's good, I said. Yes. Is that all? Vethsaratha looked at me for a moment. The amber eyes, and I understood now what that amber was and where it came from, the deep family resemblance in a color and a quality of attention that I had been looking at across a soup counter every morning for 8 months, held steady. The air asked me to convey something, she said. I waited. She said the dough was ready. She wanted you to know that. I kept my face arranged in the way I kept it arranged when I needed to, and I said, good, that's good. Vethsaratha placed her hands flat on the counter again, briefly. Then she stepped back from the service line and moved toward the eastern door, and I watched her go with the peripheral attention I had developed over 7 months of tracking a small presence at the edge of my vision. At the eastern door, she paused and turned back, and her amber eyes rested on me for a moment with a look I recognized, because I had seen it in its smaller, earlier form almost every morning for 8 months. The look of something that is paying attention and finding the thing it's attending to worth the time. Then she went through the door and was gone. I pulled my apron straight. Faye was managing the line well, but the morning traffic was building, and she was going to need me back in the next 2 minutes. I picked up the ladle and returned to my station. The gap at the eastern end of the counter was empty in the morning light, that particular still, present emptiness that is different from the emptiness of a thing that has never been occupied. The draft still came through it. It would come through it every morning until someone sealed it, and nobody had ever had a reason to seal it, and I did not imagine anyone would find one now. I stood at my station and looked at the line and thought about 12 days, about a framework agreement reachable within a season, about drawdown processes and resettlement completions, and the man who took his bowl with both hands, and the woman with her 3 children, and the elderly man who looked up for a moment before walking on. I turned back to the line, 340 milliliters, 160 of bread, half a cup of root vegetable today because today was a root vegetable day. The next person stepped forward. I ladled,